who are much more senior than myself. I see my teachers here. So I'm going to kind of hurry on this presentation a little bit because I would rather that we have a bit of a discussion. And also because of the fact that I'm on call and I'm actually speaking to you from our theater where we have a trauma case that I may have to drop off to deal with. So let me just start by sharing my slides. And just before I do that, if in the chat you could write where you're logging in from and what role or level you're at in terms of, are you a student, are you a resident, are you a consultant? That would be really nice just to give a flavor of where we're at. Okay, I can see from Libya, from Kenya, that's my senior, from London, Privilege, that's my teacher too. And so as we carry on, I think that the reason why we're having this conversation was to see how somebody sits in between two worlds within global surgery, because global surgery is really often thought about as a high income initiative, but has major consequences for low income country, global south aspects. And really, in terms of my history, I didn't know much about global surgery when I was in training. And it was a happenstance when I was Googling one day about other things. I had the privilege of attending the WFNS in Turkey and met a committee that included KIPAC called Global Surgery. And one day when I was Googling, I came across Professor Hartle. And I emailed him and I said, could I come to Tanzania? Tanzania is a very special place to many Kenyans. We think of it as a very magical space with Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, the language, the food, the culture. And I thought it'd be quite an interesting space to be in for a year, somewhere where I thought I could speak Swahili and learn from a neighboring country, having only visited Tanzania a couple of times as a child. And I was very fortunate to get that opportunity. And it was an interesting time because it was the time when COVID happened. So I arrived and within 2.5 months, the world shut down with COVID. And so my experience of global surgery is an overlap, not only of the global surgery itself, but also what happens when the world shuts down. Leading on from there is really how my association with global surgery has started and the subsequent associations, including sitting in the WFNS. So what is global surgery? I think it's about recognizing that we all need safe, affordable, and accessible surgery. And there are very many barriers to the access of the same, not only in African countries, but also in European countries, in Asian countries, etc. And it's an umbrella body that's supposed to look for solutions that cross-cut our particular problems. And it's how to look for the optimal way of utilization of global resources, capacity building equipment, advocacy, and it's interdisciplinary. And it's a global movement. So it doesn't only include doctors, it includes policymakers, nurses, healthcare workers, patient advocates, politicians, you name it. So it's a much more encompassing thing to be in, rather than just in our standard skills-based training. The idea of global surgery has evolved, and I think one of the key landmark papers is this one that's often quoted in 2018, looking at the need for neurosurgeons. And there's an estimated shortfall of about 23,200 neurosurgeons just to perform essential neurosurgery. So we're talking about infection shunts and emergencies. It doesn't cover spine, and it doesn't cover elective work such as epilepsy, functional neurosurgery. And even in this particular case, it didn't really cover even tumor surgery, which is another key area. This paper, as you can see, has been very fundamental in driving what we look at aspects of capacity building and in training. And it highlighted, if you see the reds and the oranges that cover our continent, that the area of greatest need was amongst us. The evolution of prior to calling it global surgery, there were iterations that started with initially public health. Then you have international health, tropical medicine, before we get to the global health. And when global health started in about the 1940s and the 1960s, it was mainly to deal with infectious diseases, child health, and maternal health. So surgery as a whole was absent until the latter part of the in fact, the early 2000s is when we start to see surgery more as a public health and a critical issue that needs to be addressed. It's for that reason that it's often missing in our syllabi when we are training in the continent. And therefore, one of the reasons why we are particularly absent in discussions on the same. And there are many paradigm shifts on how we approach global health, whether we look at it from a humanitarian perspective or we look at it from a security aspect. And these two sit side by side. So I said, for example, during COVID, COVID was seen more as a global threat, as a bio threat. And so when we look at disease processes around neurosurgery as a global threat, it's what happens if we have a lot of infections, for example. What will happen if they spread? What will happen if we have a lot of epilepsy? What will happen to the population? And that also tends to change the approach. If you look at it more from a global threat perspective, then the policies tend to be more self-protectionist. Whereas when you look at it from a more humanitarian, then we see more of a common humanity suffering, alleviation of suffering in individuals, and more philanthropy. And when you look at the concepts around global health and global neurosurgery, you will see both the areas being orchestrated. And it's good to know about them, because then you can choose philosophically which end of the spectrum do I lean more towards. So if I, for example, take the issue with, say, what happened in Sudan. Sudan was a stable country with a well-established neurosurgery, was training for other countries. But the war created this human catastrophe that has implications even for its neighboring states in terms of disease surveillance, capacity for services around to cope. And so the countries around it will approach global health more as self-protection. Whereas when you look at things that we have in common, like hydrocephalus, trauma, etc., we may take a more common humanity approach when dealing with it. Other divisions that can happen within global neurosurgery is the perception that there is some aspects that lie to the north that somehow have better outcomes, better resources, and those that are in the south that have lack. And which is true to many extents. It's not always true at a micro level. So we know that we have African countries that have reasonably good neurosurgical penetration and care in some areas, and then geographically in other parts, there'll be extensive lack of care. This is as true in Africa as it is in some parts of the States, where people may be far from services, they may be poor, they may have a lack of knowledge, etc. And so when you're trying to see how you fit in, it's always good to look for common ground that you may share with a partner that you're working on in a project. This was just to show that the variance on what is available and what is not as strictly as we try to view it. Now, when global neurosurgery or sessions were introduced, the word itself became a bit of a divisive word. In other words, there were some places that were more likely to call their meetings or conferences global health sessions or global neurosurgery sessions. And Africa, in that respect, is lagging, which might mean that those of us who are training or who are working may not see our work as fitting in within the global neurosurgery umbrella. And this is something that we need to address, and I'll come to it as to why that is important. The first is understanding what we bring to the table. So when I started doing global surgery work, when I came to Tanzania, is when I quickly learned that it is an amorphous being. It's a creature that's constantly evolving. And what we need to look at it is what we can bring to the table within that discussion. The first thing that we can bring is time. So I know that there are students here. When you're a student and there are projects and you want to evolve in a particularly space that is new, then you can give your time in exchange for skill acquisition. This is very important because many times people ask me, how did you get involved in it? Well, I got involved in it because during COVID, there was less operating to do. And that time meant that I could work with consultants, and Professor Qureshi was one of the senior authors in the first paper we did on COVID. I was able to exchange time for experience and mentorship. The second thing is authenticity. When we look at the global neurosurgery space, if you live in Libya, if you live in Dar es Salaam, if you live in Nairobi, you have a lived experience that helps us to understand the experience of neurosurgery, its access or lack of, its the patient journey from presentation right up to tertiary care in a way that is that enriches the conversation. The lack of that authentic experience being expressed means that our literature can end up with designing studies or writing protocols that are not applicable to our situation. So the first thing I say is that all of us here offer a lived experience of the realities of the surgery that we practice or experience. Those of us who are also here also are able to navigate the nuances of culture. Things such as, for example, headaches have different languages, the way they present, whether it'll be a male or female, a senior or a young person. Those ones have nuances of culture that are not easily captured. And therefore, the perspective that one brings to the global neurosurgery space is quite an interesting one. I'll give an example. When I said the first paper that I did with Prof. Qureshi was around COVID, and we wrote about COVID experience in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, sub-Saharan Africa. And when we initially started writing to the journals were saying, yeah, but we know about Africa. We've got some summary papers, but we were able to speak to different residents. We're able to speak to different practitioners and capture several key things. Some of the key things that we captured was the number of residents and their distribution, how many were training in countries other than their own country, whether they were getting any money or not, what had happened to their classes, what had happened to their surgical experience, and what the institutions had done to be able to continue with training. So, for example, we're able to report that a higher than expected average had changed to Zoom and going online, and some of them were still able to continue to provide neurosurgical services even during COVID with various adaptations. So to be able to get that first-hand experience and that perspective was, I think, a very important way of enriching the literature with a perspective that could only be shared by those who lived on the continent. But as I said, that took some time and sweat equity. And the other thing that it took is that it took a lot of sponsorship. So Prof. Qureshi was the president of CANS at the time, and the other authors on the paper were from different parts of Africa. And the only way you can connect is by connecting with one person who connects you to the second person to be able to undertake the same. Many people, such as Ignatius Esene, who some of you may know, were critical in ensuring that we could utilize their networks to ensure that all the countries that could be represented were represented within that paper. So that's one of the advantages of how can you get involved and why you should get involved in global neurosurgery, because you've got the lived experience, you're able to navigate the nuances of culture, and you've got a perspective uniquely of your own when it comes to advising on the papers. Local knowledge, I've talked about cultural nuances, but the dynamics and the hierarchy, knowing who to talk to, when to talk to, the health priorities within the health system, and who are also the key decision makers. So for example, if you're doing a paper on pediatrics, who do I need to consult if I'm going to look at attitudes, for example? These are some of the projects that are low-hanging fruit. You might be able to report from Libya to say, well, our experience of patients who have spina bifida is influenced by the following, and be able to compare it maybe with somebody who lives in another country like Mali or Togo or Ghana to see, are there differences from our culture, from our religion, from our financial incentives and our insurance policies. The other thing that I tell those who approach me, like the medical students, I can see there's a medical student from Sudan, is there's a hierarchy of skills presentations that are brought into the space of global surgery. The first is, I talked about time. The younger you are, you have more time. The second is IT skills. In capturing a lot of this data, we need a lot of people who can run Excel sheets, who can work on social media, who can generate summaries using AI programs, who can use language models. As you know, that Google and many others are doing language models in our local languages, and they're trying to populate them with the languages that we'd use in the medical space. So you may be considering perhaps to do to offer your IT skills in exchange for time on the project. Other things that I've done with IT skills before is when we've had meetings, is we get young people who are either residents or medical students or interns to run the IT for the meeting. So they do all the posts, they review all the presentations, they help make the presentations, and they help with the dissemination of the same in the local media. Language translation, Tanzania alone has over 100 languages, Kenya has 40, Uganda has 50, and so on and so forth. So the ability to get information from patients and be able to translate them into literature using the nuances of language is very important. I've talked about Google and many other language models that are being done in research groups, trying to translate neurosurgery information or questionnaires into local languages is another area of great need for us to be able to capture the data as it should be. And then mobilization. We all have pockets of influence, be it for patients or peers, that we can mobilize if we want to do a project, if we want to hold a meeting, if we want to run advocacy. And so this presents increasing opportunities for us to be able to network within the global space. I put here network, but I think one of the challenges that I want to mention at this point is a lot of times when we do, there was a paper that was done that showed that the vast majority of East African collaborations are with America and Europe, and very few are within the region. So it's unlikely that you'll find a paper that's between someone from Sudan and Rwanda, for example, or someone from Uganda and Burundi. So even as I talk about network, one of the things that we need to challenge is the idea that our networks need always to be a global south to global north. And instead, we need to look at models that will allow for south to south regional cooperation. One way that has been modeled and done very effectively is the BNTA, the British Neurosurgical Training Association, where the students got together and would get sponsorship from their consultants. And they would do projects together and subsequently publish them. And this is a model that I think we should start to ask ourselves between our COSEXA and our MED residency programs, whether when we are choosing and selecting our projects, we should select projects that can be co-shared so that we can be able to compare, is the population in Kampala similar to the population in Kigali? Is the outcomes in Kigali similar to the outcomes in Bugando or Mbeya? And it's not only about the patients. We can look at, for example, volumes, time to surgery. We can look even at return of trainees to their original training center. I know that there were papers done through COSEXA to see how many were retained on continent. But there are many aspects of the trainee welfare, the residents' welfare, the association effect, advocacy that we can do. And our networks are as wide as the patients, the residents, the institutions. But at the moment, one of the greatest challenges we are having is that we're not collaborating with each other. We are collaborating with others outside of the continent, but we need to start asking ourselves as residents, as junior faculty, whether we can do continental collaborations. And the opportunities are huge. Advocacy. So recently, the Cameroon medical students have been doing an advocacy project around seizures and management of seizures and perceptions of seizures. They also did one on road traffic accidents and the perceptions of safety. South Africa has just completed a brain health week under the UCT program. So there are many opportunities that we can collaborate with each other within the global neurosurgery space and within the region space. So it's a question of, can we sit down and elucidate what areas we want to work with and how we are going to do them. Research. Now, research is an interesting one. In the time that we have been, in the last 10 years, there are a couple of important journals that have been launched. So we have a journal for neurosurgery of East Africa that's hosted by the University of Nairobi. That's one area we can publish in. But COSEXA also has a journal, and a few other journals have come up specifically within the neuro space. So the ability for us to disseminate information in index journals, or at least Google index journals or Scopus index journals, is increasing, but our output is still low. Our output is still mainly by collaborations with those outside, or they are within the MED thesis setup that rarely then make it out to meetings afterwards. So what we need to do is be more intentional about the research, to ask questions that are pertinent to us, but also plan and link them to meetings that are happening. So within that, I will now use that as a point to plug in that next week, there's a meeting in Dar es Salaam. So that's one way we can come and present our findings. And next year, Dar es Salaam is hosting the WFNS Global Neurosurgery Conference. So we can agree as participants in this meeting to say, we want to bring our local research and we want to present it at our local meetings. There is SNOSA, which is happening in Ivory Coast, which is the Society of Neuro-Oncology of Sub-Saharan Africa. And that includes scholarships for those who submit. And the same is true for the World Federation of Neuro-Oncology or Neuro-Oncology, which is being held in Hawaii in November. So there are areas where our research can be presented, but there are many times that we don't put our research forward for consideration or presentation and publication. And secondly, that often our research questions cover very narrow areas. So you'll find a lot around trauma, but you find not as much around tumors, around functional neurosurgery, not much about focused pediatric work outside of infection and hydrocephalus. So there are areas, even as we are planning, we need to think where else we can go. Teaching and training is another one. So COSEXA offers some shared training opportunities. Dar es Salaam, through the Global Neurosurgery, has offered hybrid teaching sessions, and in May will offer a combined session with EANS. But we still have an opportunity, for example, to do core faculty sharing, where we can meet online or we can meet in person and form a regional network for training, and as well as share that same information with others off the continent. Social media management of journals. So CNS, so the neurosurgery, World Neurosurgery, etc., have social media management opportunities that are open to people who are online here, especially if you're like a medical student or you're IT savvy or you're a resident, where you get to post papers and to boost them and to see the pattern of spread of the papers, or to help to create online postings for summaries of papers. The reason why this is important is it's a way of learning about screening and reading more journal articles. It's also a way of building capacity so that we can also help our local journals do the same. Journal reviewing, I've talked about 2 local journals already, and they're always calling out for reviewers because, for example, I review for World Neurosurgery and occasionally for neurosurgery. If somebody presents a paper that is from our region, it's important that somebody from the region also has access to that paper to read and to say, is this congruent with our experience on the ground? Secondly, by reading and reviewing papers from other regions, you constantly are informing and educating yourself in academic language, in where research is heading. And it's an opportunity also to cultivate your own critical appraisal skills. And then lastly, I put there the opportunities for being faculty. So in all our respective residency programs, there's an opportunity to be a trainer in global neurosurgery or in standard skills acquisition, to be an examiner, to submit questions, because COSEXA is looking for people who can set questions. Or if you're working with a medical school, so in Kenya, we have one called the Ubongo Club, but there are neuro clubs that are being set up in most countries, the ability to go and help to teach, to train, and to help those medical school programs with their neuroscience training. So this was just a reflection about the international meetings, and I think I've already spoken about it before, that although they're increasing, Africa is still behind. And the same is true for conferences, although that's going to be, the mantle is upon us that next year when Dar es Salaam hosts its meeting, that we show up in a big way to ensure that that's successful, to show that an African Global Neurosurgery Conference can be well attended. Other areas of opportunity. So at the bottom there, I put the WFNS. So they have a young neurosurgery forum that is open to all the trainees who are here. You can just Google them online and join the group. You can become an advocate. You can help with admin. You can be involved in papers. The Young African Neurosurgeons, so Young CANS, has done a tremendous amount of work on the same. At the top there, I put Intersurgeon. So Intersurgeon is like a dating platform for those who have skills that they want to match or have needs. And you're welcome to join it at any stage of your training, from when you're a student right up to when you're a consultant. And this is a good way of offering pairings. Incision at the top is not unique to neurosurgery, but it's another advocacy forum. And then at the bottom left, we have Mission Brain. So Mission Brain Foundation is based in the US. Every year they do a hackathon. Last year, for the first time, a Cameroonian team was the winning pitch. And it was a very, very proud moment. So you can Google Mission Brain and you can Google about the hackathon. It's an opportunity to learn how to present an idea from start to finish work with a group and be able to present your findings. The opportunity that it presents in doing a hackathon is often you have experienced people teaching you how to pitch, how to write a business case. You get an opportunity to listen to other people from around the world doing their pitch as well. And you get to look at the problem that you're presenting and the solution and get feedback, almost like doing like a Dragon's Den opportunity. So for the students and the young residents who are here, please look out for this year's Mission Brain hackathon. And then I'll put their Future African Neurosurgeons group. This was set up by Ulrich, also from Cameroon. I think Cameroon's doing an outstanding job at the moment in the global surgery space. And what it does is, whether you're interested in neuroscience, neurology, neuroradiology, it's a group of medical students and residents. They have weekly training. So every Saturday, there is a tutorial that's offered. They have a research arm, they have an advocacy arm, and they have a collaborations arm. So they have partnered with several groups in the UK and the US to write collaborative papers on student experiences and disease processes, as well as advocacy and other aspects of global neurosurgery. So because this presentation today was about where can I plug myself in, you can see there are very many centers that are act like a nidus for integration of your global surgery experiences. The barriers, I think the first one that's always mentioned is finances. It's very expensive to travel across Africa, but it's increasingly cheap and available for us to do things online. The idea of research assistance and funding other aspects of our research can be a challenge, but more and more, there are free online courses on principles of research. Many, provided you are registered as a student through the WHO initiative of Hinari, you can get access to a lot of journals that you can get to read and prepare your work. And some of the, a lot of the initial research, regardless of where in the world, including in more developing countries, are really done with sweat power. They're not really funded. It takes time before you can get a grant. Time is relative. As I said, you have more time as a student than you have as a consultant. So there can be an exchange between students and consultants for time. Motivation and appreciation. It takes time to get traction. One of the challenges that if you publish more in Western world, there's a recognition for it in your revalidation process and your progression through your career. And we don't yet see that in our settings. But if we don't record our story, then the challenge is that we won't have, unless you reflect, unless you can document, unless you archive, then you don't know if you're getting better. You don't have a point of reference when you're trying to manage your patients. So if, for example, I know that Da has a huge experience in neuroendoscopy, but if they don't publish their outcomes, when I have a patient who needs the same management, it's harder for me to know whether the literature I'm reading applies to my patients. But if Kampala was publishing, if Da was publishing, if Kigali was publishing, then I have context for people who have a similar socioeconomic background and if they have the same outcomes. We also have very few academic surgical spaces, but I don't think that you need to wait to be in an academic space to get the traction that you need within the global surgery. Imposter syndrome. For everything that I have said, there is no formal training for global surgery. Yes, there are courses that you can attend, but most of it is just being willing to be there, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in research, whether it's in advocacy. There isn't a formal qualification that gives one the authority to be in that space. It does help to have a sponsor, but sponsors are more likely to sponsor those who are willing. So once you step out and you start to do these projects is when you're more likely to be included in subsequent projects. The lack of documentation is a huge problem for us in the area. So our ability to own the project, to archive it, to perpetuate the ideas is all based on whether or not we can document. If we want to have, I was recently involved in writing SOTA, which is the National Surgery, Orthopaedic and Trauma Plan. The biggest problem we have is for everything that we're saying, it's more, well, this is common knowledge, but we haven't spent the time documenting the need. We haven't documented the basic demographics, the outcomes, what's happening where, and this is a real problem. Lastly, one of the challenges that we tend to have is when we feel that we're not fully involved, one of the common things we tend to do is be passive participants. So we'll turn up to the webinar, we'll turn up to the course, and that takes you so far. It's like watching a movie. It's amazing. but it doesn't automatically turn you into Bruce Lee, and it doesn't give you the skills to be Bruce Lee. You have to go to the gym, and you have to train, you have to fall. And so in global surgery, for those of you who come to many courses and listen to very many webinars, I encourage you to just take a step of faith and actually step into it and get involved in a project, join a committee, join social media, track things, document things, because that's the only way you can grow your career and we can grow the information around global surgery in our space. Yeah, so this was just about authorship and the challenges of authorship, but I think I'll just stop there and be open to questions. Marta, it's nice to have you here. Any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Beverly, for the nice presentation. I think it's time for the floor to ask any questions. If you have any, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself and proceed with your question. Welcome.
Hi, Dr. Beverly. I'm Martha. I just wanted to thank you for this great presentation. I'm in your job a couple of years later, and I can tell you that it is very exciting to see how the African community is growing. Next week, we are hosting our global neurosurgery course. We have participants from all over Africa, going from Morocco, Liberia, Ghana, Libya, really from everywhere of Africa. And it's been really humbling to see everyone wanting to participate. We are hosting an abstract competition, and I received abstracts from all over Africa, which is also very exciting. And I hope some of you that are here connected will join us next week, and we will have time to discuss these great ideas and our ongoing and future projects. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. I'm very excited. I'm just wondering, the abstracts, is there any intention to publish them? Because we could try and see whether we can get them in a local journal.
That's actually a great idea. We have chosen 3 abstracts for presentation out of many, and we can encourage them and coach them to submit them to a journal after the course. I think that would be a great idea.
So the Annals of Surgery, which is one of the local journals, even has a mentorship program within it, as does this COSEXA journal, to help the author from start to finish, which is important. If you're feeling like, how am I going to do this? There are opportunities to help translate those ideas into publications.
We'll discuss this next week. You're joining on Friday, right?
I am very, very excited.
Yeah. We'll have a very exciting discussion about life as a neurosurgeon. How is it perceived, men versus women? So that would be interesting also.
Yes, I'm looking forward.
All right, thank you. Apima, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, Dr. Romani. My name is Apima. So the collegiate residency programs have actually given a chance to a lot of struggling residents out here to train and acquire neurosurgical skills. However, the opportunities are actually so limited to very few centers, and it has posed us a challenge for the residents who are aspiring to undertake their neurosurgical training. Is there any are there any plans to try and enhance this and make it easier for even the rest of the people aspiring to do the same?
So thank you. I think one of the challenges about neurosurgery, it's skewed to the right, as Mr. Mendoza will attribute even in the UK, the competition ratios for a place for neurosurgery training is really, really tight. So I think the first thing to encourage anyone is to make sure that your CV is as strong as possible. So for those of you who are medical students, getting involved in the neuroscience clubs, etc., is very important. The second thing is there are attempts to expand training, but the capacity to train has to be matched by the ability to train well. So as you know, for example, in Tanzania, Moi is the biggest training center, but there are other training centers coming up in Tanzania. In Kenya, we have two main programs. We have an MEd program in the University of Nairobi, and then we have the COSEXA training program that runs through at least 4 centers, Aga Khan being one of them. And then you have a similar thing in Uganda, as well as in Rwanda. Burundi doesn't yet have a program. So the reason I mentioned that is within the East Africa, it doesn't really matter which country you train in. It's whether you can get into a training program. So we have Tanzanians who have trained in Kenya, Kenyans who have trained in Tanzania, Ugandans who have trained in Kenya and Tanzania, and vice versa. So when you're applying, remember that there is a cross recognition within the region of your training qualifications across the East African medical boards. So apply to all the training programs you can. Second challenge, of course, is financing, and that's a harder thing to deal with. More than a third of African residents don't have a steady income when they're doing their residency program. So one of the ways that you can try and do that is to try and see if you can be attached to a public hospital that will support your training, or whether you can get some scholarships. Perhaps I can ask Prof. Qureshi to just highlight a little bit about some of the scholarship opportunities and the training opportunities beyond East Africa that they may be able to apply for. Prof. Qureshi?
Yeah, sure. I think I was deliberately trying to not raise my hand because I really want this to be about the young neurosurgeons interacting and feeling comfortable. But my presence is obviously to encourage everyone to come together. And your talk was brilliant. Now, as far as scholarships are concerned, there are possibilities that are available. Primarily, the traditional one has been the WFNS, the World Federation Scholarships, because for decades now there has been a focus on Africa, because there was considered to be a need to support African young neurosurgeons. The problem there is that the budgets are, as always, limited. So if you are in one of the programs in the Francophone area, particularly the one that's around Morocco, you're eligible to apply for the WFNS scholarship. And then in the second regional center, which is in the East Central Southern African region, again, the World Federation does offer scholarships. There is the Majid Sami Africa 100 scholarship available. Currently, I serve as a secretary for Professor Majid Sami. Applications can come to us, and we can then consider candidates for that. Bob Dempsey with FIANS has been very, very supportive through getting 2 families, the Clark family and the Bassett family, to provide different types of support funding to support young neurosurgeons, particularly also from Africa, but other places, because it's an international foundation for international education. So there are candidates from other LMIC regions who also get it. So I think if you are in need to apply for scholarships, these are the common ones, and I can say that we can get you in contact with Professor Bob Dempsey and with Professor Majid Sami's Africa 100 program, as well as the WFNS. And for some time now, I have been their contact person, but I would obviously want to see younger individuals getting involved. But you've got to get involved first before you are given the responsibility of coordinating scholarships. So people like Beverly and others who have now begun to show a lot of enthusiasm in global work would, I'm sure, be happy to be contact persons, and they can always pass them over to us to see how we can best support them. So we obviously continue to talk to entrepreneurs and other families who have made good profits through their businesses to support scholarships in the neurosurgical world. We've got a few come up, but I think through the foundation, it's the Asian countries that have become more active in that area. But for Africa, it's been WFNS, the Clark, the Besset, and the Africa 100 that really offers these scholarships, and I'd be happy to coordinate that for any young neurosurgeon who wishes to have that.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your nice contribution. I would like to ask Andrew Alaaeldin to unmute and ask his question. Welcome.
Hello, hi, Bev. Good to see you. It's been a while, and good to see other familiar faces in the room as well. So yeah, thanks for all the brilliant work you're doing. Now, it's very interesting listening to all the stuff you talked about, and I think the part that really grabbed my attention was when you highlighted there's been a lot between the global north, global south. How about improving on kind of south-south? Over the last coming months, I've been involved in meetings with people like Ernest Barthelemy, Arvan. We're working on a lot of global neurosurgery projects. I know in the UK here, there's a lot of work. I was invited 2 weeks ago to sit on some grand round in Jamaica. There's a lot of work now with the Caribbean Society of Neurosurgeons. And informally, I think I've been part of maybe about 10 African neurosurgeons who've come to work in the UK. But then my worry is, how do we measure the success of these collaborations? What are your thoughts on the metrics? How do we benchmark it? How do we say, okay, now there are these collaborations, whether it's north-south, whether it's south-south, how do we assess the success so that it's not just, projects that people are working on and it doesn't really bear any fruit locally or regionally?
So that's a really good question. I think one of the challenges that happens with a lot of these partnerships is they don't always start with clear goals. A lot of partnerships within global neurosurgery are relationship-based, and relationships evolve in very many different ways. So I think one of the ways that we need to look at is, first of all, to have a database of ongoing collaborations, because some of the work that we're doing is repetitive work. You'll find that there's investment in maybe equipment by more than one group, and eventually the equipment cancels itself out because the biomedical aspects of it have not been thought out. So the first thing is agreeing for every project, what is the metric? If I look at one metric that the BNTA had agreed with the young African neurosurgeons, was to look at the number of publications they were going to do in a year and the number of presentations. So they, in their agreement at the time, they had a very clear goal of what they were going to achieve within that year. And that allowed the group to continuously keep an eye. It's probably not the BNTA, it's the one before the BNTA. I'm trying to remember what it's called. So that's one group that started with a clear purpose. Another project that has a clear purpose is a scoliosis collaboration that happens in Tanzania and Kenya, because there is a database of how many cases they see. They run hybrid training that I got involved in when I was first starting out. So you had to do prospective learning followed by skills acquisition. And then after that, they have been documenting how many cases of scoliosis they're doing and how those have been proctored. So in the beginning, it was, we show you, you see. Then there was a hybrid training program of recognizing which aspects of scoliosis should be managed in what way, which ones can be conservatively managed. Then there were a series of joint cases. And now through Proximi, you have the local surgeons doing it. And I think the next step is, I think MOE is working towards being a training center for scoliosis. So this is a project that has started with clear guidelines at every point. Some are very, for example, mentorship for medical students or residents. I'm not sure of any that has had an effective metric that will say, since we started mentoring these residents, either they've had technical or non-technical skills acquisition that have made a difference. One key thing that I think is very easy for us to measure if we wanted to is the vast majority of people we train become pioneer surgeons for services or stations. So for example, Boaz is here. Boaz, I believe you're in Bear, amongst many of the other surgeons here. So one of the questions we could ask is, after training, and we offer structured mentorship, how many people go back to where they were sponsored from? How quickly do they set up a service? And once they set up a service, what's the skill mix for that service? So there are things that we can do, but we haven't done. But it's important that, as you said, that we do them so that we know whether we're being successful or not. I can see you put up the scoliosis program up as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much. Of course, next webinar, we'll be having Professor Alaa, the one who has been spearheaded this program here, and we'll hear more about his experience and yeah, of course, in the whole of the educational program in managing complex spinal deformities in LMICs. Sylvia, you had a question. Can you unmute yourself and in 2 minutes?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Baby, for such a great presentation, which is really motivated presentation and inspiring one. So I would like to know how nurses, because the neurosurgeons training aspect is straightforward, but for the nurses, it's really a challenge because there's no background of neuroscience nursing, I think, in East and Central Africa as well. Tanzania, we are trying to see how we can empower others just through fellowship. So how can the pioneers neuroscience nursing in Tanzania get involved in collaboration and scholarship opportunities so that they can be trainers to train others in the region? Thank you.
I know Sylvia very well, and I hold her in very high esteem. I think so one of the problems that we've had in the global neurosurgery is that it's been very doctor focused. And even when we say doctor focused, it's been more about the surgeon. So for example, the number of surgeons outstrip the number of neuroanesthetists. And certainly we don't have a nursing program. That means that, you do the surgery, but we don't get the support that we need at every aspect of the nursing care. So when we're in Tanzania, Sylvia can attest to, they've had a long relationship with different nurses, Karen Marsh and many others, who've come to Tanzania and have helped to upskill the nurses in Tanzania. I think, Sylvia, one of the challenges is that we don't tend to have many joint meetings where doctors and nurses are on the same platform for you to advocate for all the experience that has been gained through the PNNT program, so it can be replicated in other parts of East Africa. I know at the last global surgery conference in Dar, there were some nurses who came from Kenya, but there were only 2, and they didn't come from the same center. So I think that we may need to talk about writing a curriculum. The curriculum will have to be in-service training, and will have to be a combination of hybrid, online, and some skill acquisition. And then we'd have to be very clear which are the most important skills and in what sections, the ones for the theaters, the ones for the ward, the ones for critical care, but also the ones for long-term surveillance. So Tanzania has several nurses who follow up the hydrocephalus babies. They have a wealth of data, but that service has not been replicated outside of the faith-based mission hospitals in the region. And so that's another missed opportunity for us to capacity build. So I don't know if I've captured it, but we need to have a more structured way. And also when we apply for grants, we need to include the nursing and other health staff in the educational and the academic program, so they too can attend meetings and be able to present the work that they're doing. Sylvia, have I captured?
Yes, sure. You captured it well. Thank you for that approach. Thank you. We are looking forward to see how we can go through about and make it awareness. awareness campaign. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Sylvia. Is there any question on the chat, maybe? Let's see. Yeah, so this is Marwa.
I think that was a metrics question.
Okay, all right, the answer, yeah.
Metrics, yeah.
And then Anton.
There
Thank
was
you.
another question around AI and simulation training.
Yeah.
Of the technological advances, what innovative strategies can be adapted to integrate these tools into mentorship without widening the existing resource gap? So first of all, I think that the gap technologically is not as wide as we think. This morning, I was with my colleague and his glasses are smart glasses, which I hadn't seen before with any other colleague. So we know that, for example, in Tanzania, they've been able to use Vuzix, and now we have Proximi in the region, another UK-based simulation and proctorship program that's now available in the region in several hospitals. When it comes to AI models, I think that some of us are going to have to learn how to integrate technology into the available systems. There are several technology hubs, Nairobi being one of them, that is looking at the health space and the integration of health technologies. Most of them have concentrated on maternal health and community health. So it'll be a question of asking whether we can form a focus group for those who will work within the neuro space. In Aga Khan, we have the Brain and Mind Institute that has done some AI projects and simulation projects around cognitive decline, but we haven't done anything on TBI. We haven't done anything on, for example, neural infections. We haven't even done anything on demographic studies, etc. So that's an area of lack. Robotics, I don't think there's a working robot in the region within the neurosurgery theaters. And I'm not always sure that it is where our focus should be. The robots are quite expensive. And if we're going to be working on upskilling, they may not be, so not all technology is immediately effective. So even if you go to a high-income country, robots are good, but robots are not the bread and butter of providing neuro care. So we may want to make decisions around where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. Simulation training, Moy does it, we do it. What we don't have is shared modules on simulation training. There are high and low tech models that have been used for neurosurgery, using sawbones, using eggs, using drilling, and many other simulation stations. So those already exist. But the problem, I suppose, is that you tend to get exposed to them once you're a resident and not before residency. But majority of the neuro patients will be seen by interns and MOs before they get to us. So there's a gap there on how we transfer neuro skills, neuro assessment skills beyond the neurosurgery centers. I don't know if that's, I think that was that.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have Dr. Nige Mendoza from UK. Dr. Nige has been involved actively in supporting the young neurosurgeon to get an opportunity to visit, to do some observership or fellowship in UK. Dr. Nige, welcome. So,
Yeah,
I'm
thanks.
very happy to see you
Beverly,
here. Yeah,
Beverly, that was a great talk. As for robots, I think you should forget it. We don't have a robot in Imperial. They're very expensive and aren't used very much. With regards to the Society of British Neurological Surgeons, what we are able to offer are funded observerships for a period of up to 12 weeks, which can be applied through the SBNS website.
right.
To come to, we have 26 units, and a lot of our units are very happy to take candidates for a period of observation and training.
Thank you so much. So I think the timing has changed a bit. Dr. Anton, can you update? Because towards the end, I think after this, the coming webinar will be around 6 p.m. East Africa time, because the New York time has changed currently. Dr. Anton, can you share the link so that people can update their Google Calendar to align with the changes. Otherwise,
Hello,
thank you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it will be 6 p.m. East African time. Stay as such, and then 11 a.m. New York time moving forward. But I've put in the chats links for your like Google Calendar, Outlook, and Yahoo so that it updates, because at the moment it will be 5 p.m. on your calendar. So if you click that link, it will automatically update it on your calendar.
Fine. Otherwise, thank you so much, everybody. I think we'll be able to meet again on the next webinar, where we'll be having hosting Dr. Alaa, the professor of pediatric